From physical torment to psychological abuse, the system was rife with methods designed to control, dehumanize, and instill fear. Delving into the top 10 shocking things that were normal to slaves. Number 10. Mutilation. Enslaved individuals were frequently required to labor in extremely challenging physical conditions, especially in agricultural settings like fields or cotton plantations. Others served within their enslavers' households and were expected to have an appearance of tidiness and cleanliness. This group of slaves often had lighter skin or better communication abilities. Regardless of their roles, it would have been reasonable to expect that the well-being of the slaves' bodies would be safeguarded and looked after. Unfortunately, this was seldom the case. Particularly when slaves resisted their masters or overseers, instances of bodily harm were commonplace. This could involve actions such as cutting off ears or inflicting wounds on the flesh. In more severe cases, limbs were amputated, eyes were gouged out, hamstrings were severed, and even castration of both males and females occurred. Tragically, medical care was frequently withheld from the victims, leading to fatalities due to infections, blood loss, and other complications. Number 9. Smoked alive. Over time, numerous states with enslaved populations introduced legislation concerning the care, welfare, and rights of slaves. In principle, this was meant to offer some safeguards against mistreatment and cruelty. However, in practice, these laws were seldom put into action. Historical records depict how various forms of punishment and abuse gained popularity across different states. William W. Brown, a former escaped slave, recounted a prevalent technique used in Virginia. He recounted an incident where an owner had his slaves restrained and whipped inside a smokehouse. Additionally, a fire made from tobacco stems was ignited to subject the slaves to suffocation and smoking as an added means of punishment. Number 8. Public burnings. Frequently, penalties were enacted in a public setting. Fellow slaves were compelled to witness these actions, serving as a cautionary example to maintain good behavior or else face the same kind of discipline. On occasion, other slave owners or individuals from nearby towns would attend these events as a form of amusement. Even after the abolition of slavery, public lynchings and hangings persisted well into the 20th century. A particularly horrifying mode of punishment was public burning, where slaves were either bound to a stake or positioned above an open flame. Some slaves lost consciousness due to smoke inhalation before the fire engulfed their bodies, while others endured torment from the flames until their eventual demise. Number 7. Demotion or sale. While this form of punishment might appear less severe than the previously mentioned atrocities, it could determine whether a slave lived or died. George Washington was an advocate of using whippings and other physical penalties on slaves. Additionally, he endorsed downgrading slaves who didn't meet work expectations and selling slaves who attempted to escape multiple times. Some slaves, originally assigned to less strenuous roles like household chores or skilled trades, could be demoted to toil in the fields. This led to more brutal physical conditions, more demanding labor, and frequently more brutal treatment from masters and overseers. In the most dire circumstances, slaves were sold at low prices to owners renowned for their harsh treatment, sometimes resulting in the slave's premature deaths due to excessive labor. Number 6. Long-term chaining. The historical usage of chains in the context of slavery has been well documented. Its inception took place on slave ships, where captured Africans were restrained collectively in the ship's hulls. Repeated runaway slaves often faced prolonged chaining, whether fastened to their workstations or to other enslaved individuals. On occasion, lengthy rows of slaves were chained together to carry out basic tasks in synchronization, laying the foundation for the infamous chain gangs seen in U.S. prisons. An individual known for her cruel treatment of slaves, even by 19th century standards, was Madame Delphine LaLaurie. Numerous investigations were conducted to assess the well-being of her slaves, culminating in a fire that erupted in her residence in 1834. Allegedly triggered by an elderly female slave attempting suicide who was chained to the stove near the cooking fire, this incident led to the revelation of several slaves in appalling conditions within the LaLaurie attic. Suspended by their necks and immobilized by chains, they were positioned in a way that caused their limbs to stretch and tear. Number 5. Suspended beneath a cooking fire. Harriet Jacobs successfully escaped from enslavement and chronicled her experiences. She recounted becoming the property of a slave owner who subjected her to persistent sexual harassment, disregarding the objections of his wife. In order to elude his advances, Harriet concealed herself in the hidden space within her grandmother's ceiling, enduring this seclusion for a span of 7 years before eventually finding her way to England. In another distressing narrative, Harriet shared an incident involving a nearby slaveholder who possessed a substantial number of slaves. This individual's preferred method of punishment involved restraining a slave, suspending them off the ground, and igniting a fire below. A piece of fatty pork would be cooked over the flames, causing the burning fat to drip onto the slave's exposed skin, inflicting intense pain. Number 4. Freed blacks were kidnapped and resold into slavery. The Underground Railroad emerged several years prior to the onset of the Civil War. It comprised a network of residences and concealed locations overseen by liberated African Americans and white abolitionists. Its purpose was to aid fleeing slaves in their journey from the slave-supporting South to the emancipation-minded North. In response, the reverse Underground Railroad emerged, functioning in the opposite direction. It involved the abduction of runaway slaves and free African Americans in the North, who were then sold into slavery in the southern states. Kidnapped and free African Americans often encountered difficulties when attempting to prove their status due to concerns about the legitimacy of their documents. Number 3. Africans sold Africans into slavery. Africans were involved in the trade of fellow Africans as slaves. The ships transporting slaves to Africa had to obtain their captives from a source. Most of these ships navigated to the African coast, where they procured slaves from local tribes residing in that region. These slaves were frequently individuals who had been captured during warfare with rival tribes, often following raids. Coastal African monarchs engaged in a trade where they exchanged slaves for European weaponry. This enabled these rulers to expand their territories further inland, where they acquired new lands and slaves, which they in turn traded for more weapons. This cycle persisted, resulting in a relentless sequence. The slave trade was a driving factor behind the occurrence of numerous fatal conflicts among West African tribes several centuries ago. During the commencement of African trade with Europeans in the 16th century, slavery was not initially involved. Initially, African leaders traded commodities such as ivory and gold for European goods. However, it wasn't long before they began incorporating the trading of slaves into these transactions. Number 2. Slave owners bred slaves and used them as currency. The prohibition of the transatlantic slave trade in 1808 was intended to be a victory for both black slaves and the anti-slavery movement in the United States. However, paradoxically, it ended up benefiting the pro-slavery movement. Prior to this legislation, slave traders relied on individuals acquired or bought from Africa. Following the enactment, they shifted their focus to slaves born within the U.S. Slave breeding emerged as a practice wherein slaves were encouraged to have as many children as possible. Numerous slaveholders maintained specialized farms where a small number of male slaves were paired with numerous female slaves. The offspring of these pairings automatically became slaves from birth and were kept on the farms until they were old enough to work. Slave breeding soon became a pivotal aspect of states like Virginia, which swiftly transformed into a leading exporter of slaves to other regions. During this era, slaves became the primary commodity of the state and held more value than gold, effectively functioning as a form of currency. By 1860, the collective worth of slaves in the U.S. was an astounding $4 billion. To provide context, the entire currency in the U.S. amounted to $435.4 million during that time, and all circulating gold and silver were valued at $228.3 million. Some slaveholders even mortgaged their slaves, creating banks that converted these mortgages into bonds, which were sold globally, including in areas where slavery had been outlawed. Number 1. Whipping in the United States. Slaves, including women who were pregnant and young children, frequently faced whipping as a form of punishment. The well-known image of the slave known as Gordon reveals the presence of a network of scars on his back, raised from severe and repeated lashings. However, certain slave owners went even further. Once the wounds of their slaves began to heal, these owners instructed that the wounds be deliberately reopened, with substances like red pepper and turpentine applied to the gashes. According to some reports, one owner even crushed a brick into fine particles, mixed it with lard, and had it spread onto the wounds of a slave. This marks the end of this video. If you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and share it. Let us know your opinions in the comment section. Make sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching the video. We'll see you at the next one.